So moving on, measures of variability. The two that are most important are range and standard deviation. Again, a lot of the stuff that we're learning is not, you're not going to be like explicitly tested on it on the MCAT. Like they're not going to ask you what a standard deviation is, but it's super important to understand. I think it's really helpful, especially when you're looking at normal curves, like over here to the right. So the range is the difference between the largest and smallest values in the set. In our last example, the smallest value was 55, the largest value was 65. So our range would be 10. It's just the difference between the two. It can help us identify how large the extreme values of a set vary, or how much they vary, or how large the actual set is, but it doesn't really tell us about the distribution of the values, which becomes more important when you have larger data sets with more values. When you do range, it doesn't really tell you anything about how they're distributed. If they're close to each other, if they're close to the mean, and that's where standard deviation becomes a little bit better of a measurement, because it measures the variability. It measures how far each value is from the set's mean. You don't have to calculate the standard deviation on the MCAT, but I just put the formula to the right, just so you're just a little bit familiar with how it's calculated. So all of this up here is just the summation of each specific value minus the mean squared. You just add all of those up, divide it by the total value, like the total amount of values in the set minus 1, and take the square root. Again, not super important, but I put it there. You should be able to just at least be familiar with standard deviation. And we have percentiles and quartiles. We spoke a little bit about them when we were talking about the median. So percentile is just the value at which n% of the data set falls below. So for example, at the 60th percentile, 60% of the data set is lower at that point. And often it's often used when reporting data sets that fall on the normal distribution, like we saw in the last one. This right over here, this sort of bell curve, is called the normal distribution. So I'm sure you've heard percentiles used, especially with test scores, especially with the MCAT. Usually when people ask you how you did on the MCAT, they're going to ask you, you'll tell them your number. You guys are going to say, oh, I got a 510, I got a 515, just like all of you are going to get, and they're not going to know what you're talking about. So you can say, oh, I scored in the 80th percentile. I scored better than 80% of the people that took it, or I scored in the 90th percentile means you scored better than 90 people who took that test. So that's what percentiles are. It's just you're at the level of everything else that's below you. Quartiles, it's just another, they're called quantiles, which are just measurements. So there's percentile, which is split into 100, obviously, for percent, and there are quartiles that are split into 4. So we have the first quartile at the 25th, the second quartile at the 50th, and then the third quartile at the 75th. So it just divides the data set. It's just another way to divide the data set. You should just know that if they're talking about the second quartile, they're talking about the median, or they're talking about the 50th percentile. And yeah, like we said before, the median is the 50th percentile, and it is also known as the second quartile. They're all talking about the same thing. And we got one more review. So we're going to go back to that same example of the students measuring their heights for the class project. Same data set. 100% of you said C, which is awesome. Good job. So a group of 5 students, I'm not going to reread that again. So the number 60 would not be considered which of the following? Second quartile, which it is because we know that 60 falls right in the middle. 50th percentile, same thing. Median is the same thing as the second and 50th percentile. So the 100th percentile is not 60. In this case, the 100th percentile would actually be 65. So good job.